Thank you. I just want a photograph taken in front of this UNC sign. As many of you know, two things. One is that I'm considering my mission to promote North Carolina from my perch in New York and Washington. Secondly, I went to Duke undergraduate and Duke Law School, but before that, and I'm in the great tradition of Terry Sanford, who said, unlike some of those who say that I'm for Duke and whoever Carolina is playing, or I'm for Carolina and whoever Duke is playing, I believe, as Terry Sanford did, that you can be proudly for both and proudly for this state, which I am. I'm pleased to come here because it gives me a chance to come back to North Carolina, and I do that for friends, I do that for roots, I do that because it gives me a chance to be part of where I came from, but also some sense of the sentiments that are a part of the country. They're not just what I see from New York to Washington. This is a critical time. The debt crisis and saving our financial future are two different questions. The debt crisis is finding its way through the city in Washington, and there are meetings and there are separate tracks. And before I ever do a television show, what I always do is, in a sense, make sure that there's nothing happened in the last 5 minutes before I go on. So, the other day, I did a show with David Brooks and some other people, the New York Times columnist, David Brooks, and as soon as we finished, there was the announcement that the president was having a press conference. So we had to redo that because some of the things that we at that time, there was great optimism for the grand bargain. David had just written a column about it. So we had, in a sense, edit and redo. I want to introduce this panel because it is an extraordinary panel. I'm going to have them add to it, and we'll introduce them in alphabetical order. But what we want to do is to have something this morning that is genuinely interactive. We want you to listen, let what they say resonate, and then we will have an opportunity to engage. So in the beginning, I'll ask them, in a sense, to pursue this question. Where are we? Where should we be? Will we be? What kinds of solutions are essential? And if we fail, what are the consequences? Everybody this morning has their eye on what's happening in the financial markets in Asia. We know that August 2nd is coming, and it is real, and that there are a lot of meetings going on, but no one really knows, the last time I checked, how it will eventually end. So this panel could not be more timely, and I thank Senator Hagan for inviting me to be a part of it. So let me introduce, first of all, Gregory Brown, who's a PhD from, he is the Sarah Graham Kenan Distinguished Scholar and Professor of Finance first, and then I'll introduce each of them, and they will have not so much opening remarks, but will introduce a sense of perspective as to where we are and what they want to lead off, and then we'll mix it up in terms of this arc of where we are, where we're going, and what happens if we fail.
Well, thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Kay, for inviting me to be a part of this. It's really an honor to be with this group of experts here today, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Maybe we should have moved this over to the Dean Dome with the overflow capacity. If you had told me 3 years ago that we were going to have this kind of turnout for a symposium on fiscal policy, I wouldn't have believed you. So it's really great times to be an economist. So I want to start my comments by providing some context for how we got here. So the financial crisis was a tremendous shock to the real economy as well as a shock to financial markets. And economic conditions experienced by the country are clearly the worst since the Great Depression. There's a real deadweight cost to rapid economic contraction. And I feel that what the government did during the financial crisis was probably the right thing. They stepped in with very significant fiscal stimulus. And I think that, combined with aggressive monetary policy, probably forestalled another depression. So even if one makes conservative assumptions about policy effectiveness, which essentially means even if you assume that some of the stimulus was wasted money, you can still pretty easily conclude the recession would have been about twice as bad as the one we actually experienced without the intervention, meaning that output and employment would have declined by about twice as much. So The problem is that this intervention was massively expensive, that government expenditures have increased by roughly a cumulative 10 to 15% of GDP, depending on what baseline you use. And that's really just half the story, because government revenues also declined by roughly the same amount as incomes declined and average tax rates declined. So where does that leave us? Well, the private sector has stabilized over the last 2 years, even though the output gap is still very large. The government deficit has not declined because growth has not been strong enough to significantly increase revenues and because spending has not been reduced. But it really doesn't make sense any longer to have fiscal policy so out of whack. The short-run conundrum to this is that a rapid contraction in fiscal policy will certainly take its toll on economic growth in the short run, and don't believe anyone that tells you otherwise. The most recent 2 quarters that we've actually seen 2 consecutive quarters of negative contributions from government expenditures to the economy. So even without a change in fiscal policy, we're already starting to see that drag from government spending. So fairly rapidly, we moved to a scenario where instead of the government helping to support the private sector is having to support the government. And the reality is that this has to happen. It's a logical consequence of a debt binge across almost the entire U.S. economy over the last 20 years, as well as the federal government over just the last few years. And unfortunately, this is just a short-term problem. The long-run problem is even more dire. There's simply no way that the government can make good on all of the promises that it's made. For example, Medicare is going to bankrupt the country if there aren't significant reforms. And people are going to have to do things like work longer, save more. The solution in terms of government spending is that it's going to have to come down, at least relative to projected spending. And this is a reality. But this also isn't news. Economists have been saying this for years. And you know, the long-term government policy has been on an unsustainable path, and we've known this. It's just, you know, for better or worse, the severity of the current budget situation that's bringing this problem to a head. So I really have mixed feelings about what's going on right now in Washington. I think it's good that the budget issues are getting some recognition, including some of the long-term budget issues. I think regardless of one's political leanings, you can give some credit to the Republicans and the Tea Party affiliates for forcing the issue. It's very tempting to just kick this down the road from a political perspective. I think the Democrats and President Obama deserve some credit for laying the groundwork for real progress through things like the Simpson-Bowles Commission. But it seems that these potentially positive developments are increasingly overshadowed by unproductive political drama. And just to give an outsider's perspective on this, I think that politicians have kind of lost touch with reality in some important ways. So for example, consider how fiscal policy treats inflation. So the recent proposals, including the Simpson-Bowles Commission and the Gang of Six proposal last week, have, as part of those proposals, indexing Social Security benefits so it uses the so-called chain weight CPI instead of the regular CPI. This amounts to growing benefits at a rate of about 0.3% less per year. And more importantly, this is something that almost all economists think is a more accurate way of measuring inflation. It also has almost no near-term effects on benefits and helps solve the long-term solvency issues for Social Security. Yet many Democrats are upset by this because they claim it cuts benefits. On the other side of the aisle, we see some recent proposals have included a provision to index mandatory user fees to inflation. And some Republicans have objected to this because it's seen as a new tax. Of course, it's not a new tax. It's just indexing revenue to inflation the same way we adjust expenditures for inflation, such as Social Security. So I'm not an expert on politics, but it seems that despite voices of reason from the center, that loud, unreasonable voices from either side are derailing constructive solutions. And on top of this, it seems that both sides are kind of killing each other over the small stuff. So this recent question about whether we would have 1 or 2 votes to raise the ceiling before the next election seems to be missing the forest for the trees. So I think it's time to take a more reasoned approach to the U.S. fiscal situation. I also attended the event that Jack mentioned last year, and it was interesting because they were trying to encourage students to undertake grassroots activism in support of fiscal responsibility. And the message was essentially to let elected representatives know that what students' views were on fiscal policy. And I think there might be a more beneficial type of grassroots activism that anybody under 30 could do. Simply get on the phone, call up your parents. Don't text them because most parents aren't good at that kind of thing. And say, Mom, Dad, I'm really sorry, but you can't have all the benefits that you promised yourself, or else you're going to give me a bankrupt country. And that may not be super effective, but it's the truth, and I really think that the process could use an injection of truth right now.
Thank you, Greg. Let me just say, I just saw two old friends from North Carolina sitting in the front row, Betty Kenan and Tom Kenan, so it's great to have you here. Maceo Sloan is Chairman and President and Chief Executive Officer of the Sloan Financial Group.
Good morning. This is a topic that we could talk about for weeks on end. We don't have weeks on end. August 2nd, the world comes to an end as far as America is concerned if we don't get this thing fixed. I think people don't have any idea of what damage would be done and what damage has already been done to the reputation of America. When you buy a treasury bond or a treasury note, what you pay is the risk-free rate. So you're willing to loan your money to the U.S. government for a very small rate of interest because it's considered risk-free. All other rates are pegged off of that. If you take away that feeling that it's the risk-free rate, you have changed the dynamic of economics in America forever. And it's something that cannot be reversed. There has never been a doubt that America is going to always pay on time. They're going to pay all their bills. There's always been political squabbling on both sides, going back and forth, as long as any of us can remember. But in the end, they always come to the right conclusion, and they always do what's necessary to do to maintain the integrity of the United States and the United States dollar. I have a great fear at this time that that dynamic is changing. And all of us should have a great fear that that dynamic is changing. We are now in a situation where we have ideological people on both sides that are determined that it's going to be their way or no way. And when you have it set up like that, it's a recipe for disaster. If you look at it, the question of raising the debt ceiling should not even be a question. It should be something that should have been done almost automatically, although I do agree that we do need to get our fiscal house in order. Anytime you have a situation that is set up the way that the United States government is set up right now, there is no way it can work long term. You know, I'd like to run my household and borrow 42 cents of every dollar that I spend and have unlimited borrowing power. That sounds like that would be kind of fun. Unfortunately, that's what we're doing right now in America. We're borrowing 42 cents of every dollar that the U.S. government spends. And that is something that cannot be sustained. The magnitude of the national debt itself is not what's important. It's the direction of it. And the direction of it right now is something like we have never seen before. If you look at our national debt, when George W. took over, national debt was somewhere slightly north of $5 trillion. That was the accumulated national debt of all the presidents that came before George W. When George W. left, we were just over $10 trillion. Now that is a jump with a magnitude like we have never seen before. And hopefully we'll never see it again. When Obama came in, he had a lot of work to do to repair a lot of things that had been done to the economy. He had to do the stimulus plans. He had to save some different industries. There were a lot of things that he had to do. And a lot of money was spent to do that. The national debt has now gone from $10+ trillion to 14-point-some trillion dollars. And it's headed north. When you have an annual deficit of $1.6 trillion, then that is going to accumulate at an alarming rate. And what we have to realize as Americans is that we have lived the good life. Unfortunately, we have lived a life that's a little too good. because we have been spending at a rate that we cannot sustain. It's sort of like when you look around your neighborhood and you see all the people that are living above their means. Well, America is living above its means, and we have to pull back on a number of things that we do and a number of ways that we do it. I think that this discussion will bring a number of things to light. Most people have no idea, cannot even conceive of the magnitude of dollars that we're talking about here. When you have a national debt or a budget deficit annually of $1.6 trillion, that's more money than most of us can even grasp. And it's something that we are going to have to get our arms around, because my children and my grandchildren are not going to be able to look forward to a lot of the benefits that we've enjoyed in America, because if we don't fix the whole system, if we don't reduce some of the benefits that we're paying out now to people, if we don't reduce some of the promises that we have made and get more realistic, by the time my grandchildren get around, there won't be anything left for them at all.
Thank you, Mazie. John Spratt represented South Carolina in the Congress, rose to become chairman of the Budget Committee until 2 years ago, and was a South Carolinian, but went to Davidson College before he went to Oxford and Yale, and it's a pleasure to have him back.
Charlie, it's a pleasure to be here, Senator. Thanks for having me. Let me first associate myself with all the comments that have been made so far. I'll give you just a brief estimation of where, from my perspective, we are and where we need to go. I begin with the point that these problems are difficult, no question about that, daunting, but they are not insurmountable, not by men and women of goodwill and intelligence working towards positive conclusions. We're in the countdown of a crisis, make no mistake about it. But even without the debt ceiling looming over us, we'd be faced with fiscal reality later rather than sooner, maybe. But the later we wait and the more debt we incur, the more we tempt fate. Here are the facts that are staring us in the face. Our national debt is $14.3 trillion and climbing, going north. Under current law, net interest could reach almost $1 trillion. Gross interest could reach almost $1 trillion of the year 2020. Social Security is sitting on a substantial trust fund and taking in just enough payroll taxes and trust fund interest sufficient to cover benefits. It's solvent for now, but barely. And sometime around 2040, the Social Security Administration will have exhausted its retirement trust fund and will be able to pay only about 80% of scheduled benefits. The cost of solvency, the fiscal gap, economists call it, is 1.6 percentage points. In other words, if we wanted to fix it today, we could raise the payroll tax from 12.4% to 14%, which says that's substantial. But it gives you, at least I think, the recognition that this can be done. It's doable. It hurt. Some would win, some would lose, but it can be fixed. Medicare's finances are even more daunting, but they reflect a larger problem. They reflect the relentless growth in the cost of health care, not just in Medicare, increasing at a rate higher than the per capita rate of growth in our GDP for years. For a long, long time now, the per capita cost of health care in this country, per person cost of health care, has gone up at 2 percentage points higher than the growth per capita in GDP. This year, Medicare and Medicaid will cost 5% of GDP. By 2035, it's not that far away, they'll consume 11% of GDP. That kind of cost growth has to be contained. But the cost constraints have to rein in our entire system of health care, and that goal, frankly, has eluded us for years. Putting major changes in Social Security and Medicare in the same package or basket could be more than the traffic will bear. That's why I would defer the cost savings in Medicare while looking for systemic solutions and move on with a fix to Social Security to say we're ready to step up to the problem. The cost of national defense has to be considered. It's running at record levels, higher in constant dollars, adjusted for inflation, than we spent at the peak of Vietnam or Korea. The budget bill for 2011 provides $689 billion, $689 billion for national defense. $529 billion goes into the base budget, the regular defense budget. $160 billion goes into something called overseas contingency accounts. That's code for Afghanistan and Iraq. For 2012, the President has requested $118 billion for the overseas contingency account. Now that's a sizable reduction, around $20 billion, but it still means a supplemental of $100 billion layered onto the base budget of around $550 billion. To rein in the cost of national defense, we're going to have to do more than cancel a few weapon systems and change personnel pay. We have to rethink roles and missions fundamentally. Not only what we do, but what our allies do or don't do. And we have to rethink taxes. Republicans call our budget deficit a spending problem and not a revenue problem. But as a result of the recent recession, tax revenues of the federal government fell from an average of 18% of GDP to an average of 15% of GDP over a 3-year period of time. And this shortfall, arithmetically, has clearly showed up in the deficit, no question about it. The Bush administration pushed tax cuts through Congress in 2001 and 2003 on the premise of a 10-year surplus equal to $5.7 trillion. This is what his economists at OMB told Mr. Bush when he came to office, that he had an advantage that few presidents have ever enjoyed, a budget in surplus, big-time surplus. The problem is that surplus never materialized, at least not fully. And to the extent that it did, much of it went to Iraq and Afghanistan and to Bush tax cuts. My colleagues across the aisle now have refused to consider the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. I back up, I'm not a colleague anymore. I was involuntarily retired from Congress. So I'll go back and read this sentence. Republicans now refuse to consider the 2001-2003 tax cuts, even though the surplus on which they were sold, formulated, based, no longer obtains. Erskine Bowles, to his credit, made a valiant effort, did a superb job as chairman of the commission on which I served with him. And he made a valiant effort to win Republican support for his commission's plans, which called for tax reform and rate reduction. And though he attracted Tom Coburn and Mike Crapo and a few others, he never won anything to his side, to his support, approaching a majority. But we're talking about how we can avert trillions of dollars in debt, which we're inevitably destined to amass unless we do something and do it soon. $10 trillion in debt over the next 10 years is not a unreasonable estimate at all. Looking at a problem of this kind, with the size of defense spending, with the demands of Social Security and Medicare, is clear revenues have to be part of the solution. Our fiscal problems are enormous, we can't deny it, but they're also surmountable, as I said earlier, with leaders of gravity and goodwill. And we cannot allow the world, under any circumstances, to conclude that America is not up to the challenge. We can't step up to the plate. Even if a deal is made within the next week, and it's an absolute imperative that it must be, it will take weeks to hammer out the details. And the problem will not go away. This is not something we can resolve on August the 2nd and turn then to other factors. It'll be revisited repeatedly over the 4 years to come. It took 4 sittings, 4 multi-year budgets to resolve the Reagan deficits, and they were smaller and far more tractable than today's deficit. We had Graham-Rubin-Hollins, we had the Bush Budget Summit, we had the Clinton budget of '73, and we had the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which I helped author. 4 major pieces of multi-year budget to bring the budget to heel. In that budget, those deficits were far more tame than the ones we confront today. So it's all the more reason we need to get cracking and have a solution by the 1st of August.
Thank you. John Weinberg is Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond. John.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator Hagan and the Kenan-Flagler School for inviting me to participate in this discussion and for inviting the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond to be part of this discussion. Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, as many of you probably know, represents the 5th Federal Reserve District, which covers Maryland, D.C., Virginia, West Virginia, and the Carolinas. So the benefit of working for this institution is that I get to root for the athletic teams of all of the fine colleges and universities throughout the 5th Federal Reserve District. Now, the other panelists have already done a very good job of laying out a lot of the facts of the situation we're facing, both the political facts and the economic facts. I'd like to talk a little bit about the perspective I hope to bring to this discussion. As an economist working for the central bank, the Federal Reserve, one of my main tasks is to formulate advice for the path of monetary policy, which the Federal Open Market Committee manages through its management of short-term interest rates and through its management of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Now, most of the time, we like to think of monetary policy, managed by the central bank, and fiscal policy, managed by the legislative and executive branches of the government, as distinct and separable forces in the economy. But there's a number of reasons why they can't be completely separated all the time. One, of course, is that both the Fed, the central bank, and the branches of government responsible for fiscal policy have the same objective of achieving the best performance possible for the U.S. economy. Now, related to that is the fact that the appropriate path of monetary policy depends on our assessment of the current state of the economy and its likely near-term trend. And choices and actions affecting fiscal policy can and often do have significant effects on the state of the economy and the path that it's likely to be following, and therefore have implications for how we think about the appropriate path of monetary policy. Now, so with regard to the situation that we're currently facing, the situation that's brought us here today, I think it's important from the point of view of a macroeconomist thinking about monetary policy to think of the issue in terms of two separate questions, two separate issues. One, of course, is the immediate question of the debt ceiling. I think the thing to think about there is, well, what happens if the debt ceiling is not raised? I mean, this is a question that everyone has on their mind. There's a lot of uncertainties around what would happen if the debt ceiling is not raised. The immediate thing that it would imply is that it would imply a cash flow problem for the U.S. government, right? And without being able to raise new debt, then that limits the cash flow that the government has available to pay the things it needs to pay. And that could mean drastic disruptions to payments of the full array of expenditures that the government makes, whether it's payments of salaries to employees or payments of benefits to retirees or any of the things that the government spends money on. That sort of disruption, especially if it came in sort of an abrupt, drastic way, would certainly have significant negative consequences for the economy, for aggregate spending and the path of the economy, and for employment as well. The other thing that could happen because of this disruption to cash flow is a disruption to the payment on the government debt, and this has already been referred to as something that would have very unpredictable consequences in financial markets, because the status of U.S. Treasury debt as Maceo described it, risk-free obligations could be called into question, and the financial consequences, the financial instability that could bring about could also have significant consequences for the economy. I think it's hard to say just how severely financial markets might react to such an event of a non-payment of some obligations on the government debt, but it's pretty safe to say that the reaction wouldn't be positive. I'll leave it to a Federal Reserve economist to state the obvious. So that's the immediate issue. The longer term issue has to do, again, as has been described by the other panelists already, with the sustainability of the fiscal path implied by the set of policies that we already have, the set of spending policies that are the result of decisions we, our representatives in Congress, have made in the past up to now, and those imply a path for spending and revenues that's not sustainable. And so when we think about the effects of that, I think there's maybe a few points to bear in mind. One is that if we set aside the immediate problem of raising the debt ceiling, if we think that our leaders in Congress will find a way to raise the debt ceiling before the deadline so that we don't face this abrupt cash flow problem I just spoke of, then there really isn't strong evidence that we are near sort of the cliff of a fiscal crisis, the way things are occurring in the European periphery countries now. I mean, simply by the fact that the rates on federal government securities still have not reflected significant risk premia yet. That doesn't mean it's not a problem, and that doesn't mean it's not a problem that needs to be addressed, because even if we're not near that cliff, that limiting point, the problem is we don't know where that point is. It's very hard to predict when, as we go along a path of an unsustainable fiscal policy, when we transition from the state where people are sort of discounting the necessary adjustments as being far off enough in the future that they're not having a big effect now, transitioning from that to a state where people start taking that into greater account, and that affects spending decisions now and interest rates now, and creates a significant problem for the trouble. It's hard to predict when that switch occurs, and so visible progress towards a longer-term solution, a longer-term plan to a sustainable path for fiscal policy will help us avoid finding out where that cliff is.
Thank you, John. Mark Yusko is Chief Executive Officer and Chief Investment Officer of Morgan Creek Capital Management. Before that, in 2004, previous to 2004, was Chief Investment Officer here at the University of North Carolina. Mark?
Well, thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Senator Hagan, for having me, and the Kenan Institute for sponsoring this event. You know, it's actually a great privilege to be here to talk about this, because my livelihood depends on it, in the sense that the 30,000 individuals and institutions that have entrusted us with their capital, they pay us to take risk. And taking risk is dependent on our ability, as Maceo said, to have a risk-free rate from which we can have a benchmark. So the idea that that could disappear, that we could have a default on that risk-free rate is really incomprehensible from the perspective of an allocator of capital. And in many ways, the whole idea of a debt limit is really kind of silly. If you think about it, no one tells you how much you can borrow if you want to go out and buy a house. It's limited by what the market will give you for the collateral of that home. And the same thing's true here, is the market has told Europe that they have exceeded their debt limit. Their cost of financing has risen from 3 or 4% to 20%. And they, if you've seen the cover of The Economist, they're on the edge of that cliff. We're just a little bit behind them on the plank. So we got a ways to go. And the idea that we have this debt ceiling, we have to talk about it every few years, just doesn't make sense. The market should really dictate how much we can borrow and still be entrusted as the risk-free rate with the world reserve currency. So the real problem is not debt. Debt is not evil. Many people think it is, but debt in and of itself, most people wouldn't have a home if it weren't for debt. We borrow, we have a mortgage, and as long as that mortgage isn't excessive and we have some equity in our home, then debt makes some sense. Having a little bit of debt to grow faster makes a lot of sense. The problem is, once you get to a certain level of debt, your growth actually slows. So in the 50s, we didn't have much debt in this country. And And by the 60s and 70s, we had grown very quickly by beginning to lever back up after the Depression-era baby said, debt is evil. Then, once we got into the 90s and into the 2000s, the debt began to be excessive, meaning that growth slowed because the cost of servicing that debt became too high. So the question really isn't, do we have too much debt or not too much debt? The real question is the liabilities. Our country faces a daunting challenge. We have 80 trillion. See, none of y'all shuddered when I said the word trillion. And I've only been in North Carolina for 12 years, so now I say y'all, but I didn't before. And when I said the word trillion, no one in this room shuddered. Y'all think that's a normal number. You realize that I'm going to lock these doors, and we're going to sit here together, and we're going to spend $1,000 every second for the next 31.7 years. That's $1 trillion. We owe 80 of those babies for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, prescription drugs, phony and fraudy. Okay? When you take all those things together, that's $80 trillion. Only 4 things we can do to cover that. We can do revenue enhancement. It's a fancy word for taxes. You guys do realize that the all-in income tax rate for Americans today is 9.4%. People look at me like, no, it's not 9.4%. I pay 35% or 28%. 9.4% all in, because 49% of people don't pay anything. So 9.4%. To cover 80 trillion, we'd have to go to the Russian flat tax system. Russia has a flat tax, 13%, 3 lines on their tax form. How much did you make? Multiply by 13%, send it in. We're only going to have 2 lines. How much did you make? Send it in. 100% marginal rate will cover 80 trillion of liabilities. That's not going to happen. Second thing we can do, we can cut spending. I worked for the great state of North Carolina for 7 glorious years. I loved every day that I worked for this university and for the state. And in those 7 years, I accrued a benefit. I get, when I turn 62, lifetime medical benefits for free. Now, there's no way in 7 years I put enough money in the kitty to fund that liability. So I'm not getting it. You got to work for the state for 20 years now to get that benefit. So there's no way I'm getting lifetime medical benefits free. When they set up Social Security, 1933, there were 17 workers for every retiree. They set the age that you could collect at 65, and life expectancy was 58. It was a very good plan. Today, when I turn 66, you notice I didn't say retire. When I turn 66, there'll only be 2 workers for every retiree. Okay? I only had 2 kids, so they choose between my wife and I. I lose, so I had to have a 3rd kid, so we have a 6-month-old. So the key is, actually serious, not because I needed Social Security, but because we have baby. And the key is that we have life expectancy now of 78. So to collect to 66, which doesn't make any sense. Third thing you can do, you can default. And that's what we're here to discuss. Are we going to default next Monday? Are you joking? What happens when you default? We saw this in Portugal. See, people talk about Republicans and Democrats. I actually don't believe that. I think there's in power and out of power. When you're in power, you do or say whatever it takes to stay in. And when you're out, you do or say whatever it takes to get in. So if you are in power and you default, you will suddenly find yourself out of power. So we're not going to default. Okay? Fourth is you can inflate. And that's exactly what we're doing. The most insidious risk that nobody's talked about yet, that nobody's paying attention to, that in the last 10 years, $1 bought you about 0.5% of an ounce of gold. Today, okay, it only buys you a small fraction of that. If you deflate our total debt in gold, the ultimate currency, debt has actually fallen. We are deflating ourselves by devaluing your and my currency. And that's the big risk that we should really be talking about.
Okay, let me start with you, Mark. If you say that everybody knows that we will not default, which assumes there'll be a deal. What kind of deal do you think we'll see?
Well, I wish I had an answer for that, Charlie. Here's the thing. All the bipartisanship today is the worst ever. Why? Because we have the most divided Congress and Senate since the 1900s. Early on in the early days, we had a very divided Congress and Senate. By the 60s, because of great leadership, we came more to the center. then this last election, we kicked out all the centrists and we elected all the polar opposites. So now we are surprised that we have all of this bickering. Shouldn't be a surprise. Okay, we put the guys on either side of the aisle. So what I think is going to happen is there will be increased taxes. There have to be increased taxes.
But define that, what you mean. You mean in terms of the kind of things that the president has suggested and the Gang of Six has suggested and Bowles Simpson have suggested in terms of a dramatic cut down in deductions for a whole range of things, and a dramatic cut down in subsidies?
Yeah, look, I don't have any idea what will actually occur, but there are a couple things we can do. One, the idea that people buy stuff online to avoid sales tax, just silly, right? We need to collect those taxes. If you're going to buy something, you should pay the taxes. It shouldn't matter if you buy it in a store or online, so that would solve a big chunk of it. Second thing we could do is we could actually go to a flat tax system, a consumption-based tax, rather than an income tax. That would save us about $800 billion worth of tax preparation fees every year. It's a novel idea. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but I know there'll be some increase in taxes, some decrease in spending, and in the end, they're going to have to come in, probably the 11th and a half hour, but they're going to have to come up with a solution.
You agree with that, John?
Well, I mean, as a narrow matter, and I think as a technical matter in terms of what needs to be done not to default, we don't need to solve those long-term solutions not to default.
It's true.
Congress can decide not to default tomorrow by saying we're raising the debt ceiling. So that's why I tried to think of those as separate matters. Now, I do think that that the problem of trying to establish a long-term sustainable fiscal plan is that you got to be able to convince people that you mean it. And I think sometimes it's necessary to sort of make a down payment. But again, this is something that Congress will have to debate, and I think this is what we're referring to here is that you know maybe there may be some short-term changes in spending and revenues that get made, you know, that get made maybe not immediately but close to immediately. But really, the problem is a longer-term problem. And I wonder if I could just respond for a second to the statement about inflation and measuring inflation by in terms of the value of gold. You know, if you read Federal Reserve statements and bulletins, and if you follow the chairman's press conferences that he's giving now after our two-day FOMC meetings, tend to talk about inflation in terms of what a dollar will buy in terms of a basket of goods and services, right? Not in terms of gold. Now, gold is an asset that people buy and sell for lots of reasons, and I think one thing that we've learned in the last 10 years is that asset markets sometimes have a psychology that departs from economic fundamentals. I like to think about the value of a dollar in terms of the stuff that it buys that people use, and if you look at what's been happening with inflation in the last few years since the recession. We didn't have a problem of rising inflation. Last year, we had a problem of falling inflation. Inflation, in terms of the prices of goods and services, was falling and getting very close to being negative. That was the context in which the Fed introduced its round of asset purchases last year. People call it QE2, and since last year, inflation has come back up to. Actually, it's come above what people think of as the Fed's long-term objectives of around 2%. The Fed doesn't have an explicit long-term objective, but people tend to think of it as an objective of around 2%, but has averaged has come closer to 2%, a little bit above. Most of our measures of long-term expectations suggest that people expect the Fed to continue maintaining inflation at about that level. So I would take a little bit of issue with the idea that we are currently in the process of inflating away the debt because the dollar value in terms of goods and services has not.
Let me come back and pull away from inflation, and we'll talk about economic growth and hopefully and unemployment and jobs clearly as part of this discussion. But somebody tell me what a grand bargain could be, and can you do a grand bargain of any kind without raising taxes, whatever the definition of raising taxes is? But Maceo, I ask you because I think you said to me before we came on that reasonable people could get together and make this happen without the political considerations that Mark talked about and John talked about.
Reasonable people could get together and actually get this problem solved relatively simply.
What would that be, that solution?
But the thing that prevents that is the reasonable people don't have to get reelected.
Right. Okay. But let's at least have a definition of what reasonable people would do.
All right.
If they didn't have to get reelected.
Let's take a look at some of the things we could do. One, we can sit down and we can look at our tax structure, which is a morass of, well, nobody understands the tax structure. You know, the tax code is about this thick, and even if you're a tax attorney, I doubt if you read the whole thing. We could go to a much simpler system. We have a lot of problems in our tax structure in that a lot of people don't believe that it's fair. You know, the administration talks about raising taxes for millionaires and billionaires. Well, you could take all the income from millionaires and all the income from billionaires, and you still have a huge deficit problem. So just raising taxes on millionaires and billionaires is nowhere near enough.
If you just eliminated the Bush tax cuts for those over $250,000, how much revenue would that produce over the next 10 years?
What is about 250 billion that you would reduce immediately?
There's so many variables you have to designate.
Yeah,
what do you do with
there's
AMT, the alternative minimum tax?
Right.
Well, pick up on the idea of what would you do if you were there and they gave you even more power than you had as chairman of the budget committee to fashion the deal? What would be the deal that you would like to see and you think makes sense today?
Our first formulation was everybody has to be at the table and everything has to be on the table. The second worst thing to having no agreement at all is having a shoddy agreement. And so we need to bring the leaders from both sides, both houses. It's what we did in '97. The budget types, principals were effectively ringmasters, and the leadership supported what we were doing. It made a world of difference in putting together the balanced budget agreement of 1997.
But all those meetings you're having in Washington don't include the members of the House and the members of the Senate from both parties and the president as well, and Cantor and Boehner in the same room and all that?
Not too big, or you get Andrews Air Force Base again, which is a 1990 problem.
Yeah.
But there's a right, happy medium there of leaders who have the authority to implement what they're talking about. One reason we succeeded in '97 was every time we met, the president was in the room, not in his person, but he had Frank Raines,
right.
He had Erskine Bowles, the chief of staff. They were there, and we knew they had the president's proxy, and they could negotiate it. They wouldn't say, we'll take that back and sauce and blood and be back to you. They might do that to temporize, but the key thing was the president was there, was leaning into the support of these talks, and so were the Republican leaders as well as Democratic leaders.
Well, one of the problems we have now, Charlie, is that the leadership that we have in the House and the Senate is not like the leadership used to be in the House and the Senate. Right. Speaker Boehner can go in and negotiate whatever he wants to negotiate, but then when he goes back to his caucus, they can tell him no. That never happened in the past.
And a lot of them have signed a pledge that
a
prevents
lot of them
them
have
from
signed,
signing on.
a lot of them, 234, I think it is, have signed a pledge saying no new taxes, no new revenue under any circumstances. That's ridiculous.
Which killed the grand bargain. You've been in some of these meetings, so tell us what's going on.
Is my mic on? Yeah. You know, what John Spratt was talking about in '97, go back to '86 when Social Security was reformed. You had Bob Dole, you had Robert Byrd together on the Senate, then you had Tip O'Neill, and Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan had done a study in '84 that sort of set the stage for the Social Security changes, and they got it done. I mean, it happened. And I think you look where we are right now. We've had the Fiscal Commission report. Once again, Erskine Bowles, then Republican Alan Simpson, former U.S. Senator from Wyoming. John was on the committee.
But the president never signed off on supporting that early on.
What happened here is that everything has gotten so partisan. Olympia Snowe, Republican senator from Maine, told me, oh, probably 6 months ago, she said, you know, Kay, she said, in the 2.5 years you've been here, this is all you've witnessed, all you've seen. It never used to be this way. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out now, is that you do have these polarizations on the far left and on the far right, where we've got to come together on that central. And I think when you look at what the Gang of Six has done, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, following the Fiscal Commission report that, once again, Erskine and Alan Simpson put together, it cuts, what the Gang of Six is doing, it cuts $4 trillion out of our deficit over a 10-year period. It looks at tax revenue by closing loopholes, closing exemptions. It brings down the tax code. It comes up with 3 separate brackets, the highest bracket at 29%. So it is expanding the base, it's bringing in more revenue. There's $3 of cuts for every $1 of revenue. And there's also a fix to Social Security. And anything that's the fix to Social Security stays in Social Security. It doesn't go back to reducing the deficit.
And what does it do to Medicare?
And it also does have that chain CPI within this Gang of Six. Right now, there's 32 of us, 15 Republicans and 17 Democrats, who have signed a letter, send it to the leader saying, go look at this Gang of Six. Really, in whatever deficit crisis that we're in right now, if we can incorporate parts of this into a proposal, it's, you know, it's very, you can't do it overnight. You can't do this in 3 or 4 days. So it would have to be done over a period of time. But there's a lot of people who are saying this is something that we could all come to, well, a number of us could come together on. And I think that's where the public is going to have to get involved and say, you know, Washington, it's time to put those partisanship battles aside. This is serious stuff that is going to affect immediately and over the long term. And I worry every day about the unemployment in North Carolina. We've just ratcheted up back to 9.9%. And we know that there's some places in counties throughout our state where it's much higher than that. We have got to have a long-term approach that gives people confidence again and really allows businesses to start hiring more people.
What do you think is going to happen? What's the likely compromise? Is it the McConnell plan? Is it the Reid plan? Clearly, the Boehner plan cannot pass the Senate, can it?
Right now, I'm so concerned about what's going to happen, truly. I mean, I know there's 2 other plans on the table right now, the Boehner plan, and then, from what I understand from talking to people this morning, Reid's plan would have about $2.7 trillion in cuts with no new revenue at this point in time. So, you know, we're going to have to see what happens, how it plays out. But the thing is,
Did you vote for that?
You know, I would like to see a Gang of Six type proposal in that. They're talking about some sort of debt commission. I don't think we need another debt. Well, we're going to probably have to have something. But I think we've got an excellent report that the Fiscal Commission worked on for I don't know how many months. I think we really need to be looking at that. We have got to get this problem solved, even if we do it on right now, to get this so that we avert a default crisis.
In the end, John, you've been in Congress as well. Do you think that there will be no revenue in the final plan, that's what it's going to take to get everybody on the same page?
In all reality, I think there's likely to be a short-term plan. The president said he doesn't want to sign one. In the end, I think it may be the only alternative he's got.
And short-term through when?
Through September, probably, some period of time.
So then in September, you got to revisit the whole thing.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
September, you got to revisit the whole thing. That's what he says, right?
You're the president. You sit there with a bunch of bad options in front of you, and this is the least onerous of the lot.
I would worry what the markets would do on that too, though.
Yeah.
Well, one of the
What would
problems
markets do? Somebody.
Yeah, one of the problems that you would run into if you go with
down.
a September plan is that S&P is going to downgrade your debt.
Some say S&P is going to downgrade the debt, period, whether we
Not
solve the debt
not
limitation
necessarily.
crisis.
S&P has the posture some because they missed the mortgage crisis.
Right.
You have to remember, all the rating agencies had AAAs on all of the mortgage type of instruments that have been put together right before they all went bankrupt.
Right.
So they have a credibility problem. So they cannot sit back and watch the U.S. government do this and not put them on credit watch. Now, S&P has put them on credit watch, but Moody's and Fitch have not. Moody's and Fitch still have stable on their outlook.
What does S&P do, though, if the agreement is clearly insufficient, if it's $2 trillion instead of $4 trillion?
That would give them an excuse not to downgrade the debt. They would keep it on watch. The problem that you have is that if the United States doesn't do something in the relatively near future that addresses the major problem that we have of spending 25% of the GDP and collecting revenues on 16% of it, well, you don't have to be real smart to figure that if you're spending 25% and you're collecting 16%, there's a gap there. Yeah. And you're not doing anything to address that gap. If the United States government doesn't address that gap, they will get downgraded. And you haven't seen ugly.
Charlie, there's one point that we have to really think about here is, the rating agencies are going to do what the rating agencies are going to do, but the real most critical point here is we are the world reserve currency. Whether we deserve it or not is a whole nother story, but we are the world reserve currency.
Right.
The pound sterling was the world reserve currency in 1913. 31 years later, Bretton Woods, we're anointed world reserve currency. Before that, it was a number of other countries throughout history. As long as you are the world reserve currency and you are perceived as the ultimate risk-free rate, China's going to hold a lot of treasuries. Everyone's worried that they're not owning enough. They own almost $1 trillion worth. That's a lot. Japan, similar number, about 800 billion. So long as we're the world reserve currency, we have a little more flexibility than we otherwise would. Once that starts to be eroded, and it actually is starting to be eroded with the Middle East trying to price oil transactions in euros, that was a big problem. And also with the Chinese now issuing offshore renminbi to do oil transactions in Africa. If we move away from world reserve currency status, this thing happens quickly, just like it did in Europe. And if you look at European debt, okay, it was 3-4% for a long, long time, and then bang, it was 20%. Think about this. Tim Geithner, I don't know how the guy sleeps. He has to refinance $4.1 trillion in the next 2 years. His average cost is 1.41%. If suddenly interest rates are 15%, it doesn't foot. And that's the big risk. So we just have to get the confidence back and stop squabbling. That's the real key. It's a confidence game. We are in a confidence crisis. We're not even in a liquidity crisis yet. We could be.
Okay,
But is it, do you think is it on the part of people who are mainly the Tea Party, but others in the House that are so resistant to any revenue enhancement? Is it ideology, or is it some value judgment about the economic repercussions of the deficit?
Look, we have a $1.6 trillion budget deficit in this country. How many families have a $1.6 trillion budget deficit in their house? Nobody. Okay? If you can't pay your bills, you have two choices. Increase your revenues, increase your income, or cut your spending. And we need to do both. And there are easy ways to do both. And to say no new revenues.
But that was part of the grand, that's what the grand bargain was about. Am I right, John? It was, yeah.
Well, as Maceo said, we had, or as Senator Hagan said, we had a plan. The Gang of Six plan actually addresses both sides. It buys us some time. But mostly, if we just get rid of the debt ceiling completely, just the concept, and let the market determine the level of debt. And Greg could opine much better on this than I can.
Well, I don't think there's any real risk of a default. I think the market said that. I think everybody knows how serious it is, and at the end of the day, there'll be some sort of solution. So I agree with that. So we're using that as a stick to try and solve bigger problems.
When? I mean, when? If you think there'll be some kind of agreement, when do you think?
Well, I have no expertise
Sunday
in that
night.
No, but I mean,
whatsoever.
But there has to be something. I mean, is it before August 2nd or not before August 2nd?
Yeah, no, there'll be something. I mean, something will happen in worst case, last minute, to raise the ceiling and avoid a default. So there's no question about that in my mind. I don't even want to go there. I think the bigger question is what does this mean for the economy? I think there is something to this notion that if we can get through a credible high-quality plan that does something about both short-term issues and longer-term issues, that is something that could have positive repercussions to the real economy, start alleviating some of the slow growth issues that we have that's causing unemployment to be high. I mean, a big problem with the budget right now is slow economic growth. That we have very high unemployment, the real income levels of Americans are lower. If we can find a way to increase growth by 0.5%, 1%, these are over a period of 10 years will have significant effects on the budget situation.
So is that a product of confidence, or is that a product because people are spending money, are not spending money on inventory, they're not hiring corporate America or Main Street America as well? Is it because they have no confidence in the economy, or is it because there's no demand?
It's because there's no need to hire anybody. If you stop and look at it, corporations are making record profits.
Right.
I mean, they're just blowing the roof off the profits. Every time we have an earnings season that comes up, we just kind of smile because we know that all of the companies in our portfolio are going to beat their estimates. So if you're making money hand over fist right now, why would you hire anybody and increase your cost? The second problem we have is that we are falling further and further behind as a country in our education. You know, we have to have a question of what can we do?
All right, raise your hand. We'll have people with mics will spot you, and we'll get you involved in this, as I promised earlier. Here, make it very quick. A question, not a statement, not a, okay?
There's a mic.
Well, you have a mic?
There's one up there.
Oh, right here. Oh, see, it's a stationary mic. Go ahead. Go ahead, sir. That's right.
Is this on?
Can you hear him? Yes.
My question was to Senator Hagan, and I think most of us understand that there is a very big partisan problem going on here in Congress, but is there a reason why the Senate tabled H.R. 2560, the cut, cap, and balance, when in fact it is a good first step? I know there's a lot more that we have to do, but it cuts the revenues the revenues, but the expenditures.
Okay, she understands.
Limits.
Hagan.
Okay.
You know, what it would have meant for seniors is that they would have to pay out of pocket $8,000. It would take spending down to, I believe, the 1960s level.
It says Social Security will not be touched, though.
Well, no, it's definitely, there were so many draconian things in that bill, and that's why. And it also would call, before it to even take place, that you would have to vote also on a balanced budget amendment before it would take place. And there's so, I mean, I tell you, there wasn't time to look at that kind of issues too. And it was the draconian hit on seniors, middle class, and the humongous cut in spending. You know, one thing I did want to mention too, though, and that was when we're talking about no new revenues, a lot of people in the House want to have absolutely no new revenues. If we don't increase and prevent a default, as Mark said, the interest rates that we currently pay on our Treasury bills is going to go up so high that it would really increase spending.
All right. Let me turn over here. Yes, sir.
I understand not wanting to point fingers on partisan lines, but at the same time I hear all this interest got voted out, we elected the far left and the far right. Who's the far left in this? I only see this, I understand I'm pointing he's a strong leftist.
Yeah.
I think far left is someone that would oppose changing the inflation indexing terms to a perfectly reasonable alternative and one that makes economic sense.
Yeah. Where would you define where the president is, Greg?
Well, I'd like to know more clearly where the president is, to be honest. But I think the fact that he endorsed the Gang of Six proposal is suggestive that he's willing to make a deal.
John.
The far left are those who are saying we're not doing and supporting an agreement even though we may agree with it. If it doesn't include some revenues, if the others in interest don't take something, put something into this package which would be onerous and objectionable to them. So they're the group that's making it hard also, right or wrong, put together a working majority in the House of Representatives.
I don't know where they were the far left. I'm not sure who's from the far left in the Senate. But there was a meeting in which Democratic senators were acrimonious with respect to the president, right? What was the issue for them?
Well, there was a caucus meeting last week, and it was people being...
Barbara McCuskey walked out
said it was volcanic.
Exactly.
Volcanic. I think that there were some people that were so concerned that there wasn't a good communication going on as far as what was going to be in the package, what wasn't. And that's why you've got to have a good communication, but you've also got to be able to show everything's on the table so we can move forward and get something done. It was really a lack of information and a lack of really concern about what's happening to this country right now.
For the sake of the dialogue, would it have been better if the president had laid out his plan for cutting entitlements and where he was prepared to go, rather than saying, I like the outline of the Gang of Six? Would that have been better for the dialogue? John, anybody?
I think in terms of strategy, it's better off saying, look, these are things I could agree to. Let's sit and talk and see if we can put a package together. You don't want to put something out and be the only supporter of it and have the country rise up in opposition to it. Then you look around for your friends and other supporters.
You'd advise them to be a little bit nebulous about, you know, where you'd cut, prepared to cut in entitlements. Yes, sir.
David Brooks had a great article back in November about creativity and innovation being the engines for economic growth as we move forward, and that to do that we have to thicken connections among each other. And I'm wondering what you would say that you could do, or what you suggest that we do to thicken connections between each other.
Well, I'll take a swing.
Yep.
One of the things that the American people can do is voice your opinions. We sit back too much. We sit back, we're comfortable, we don't push people. We say, oh, okay, there are a lot of things that could be done to get our fiscal house in order. We have 500,000 troops in 100 bases around the country, taking care of everybody else. How many do you think China has? None.
Outside of China, none.
Outside of China, none. Zero.
You meant how many bases we have outside in terms of South Korea and in Europe and places like that?
Everywhere we go, we stay.
Let me, yes, sir.
Isn't there an amount of hours that this, whatever decides to come to the floor will have to be debated in the Senate? So isn't it really Wednesday? It's not August 2nd, it's Wednesday, isn't it, to have something on the floor for debate?
That's what Secretary Guyton says and argues.
You know, I think that's a really good point from the Senate's perspective. The House can move very swiftly because of their procedural rules. The Senate, one senator can hold up the whole process. Anything can move by unanimous consent. But if there's a cloture vote, you have to have 32 hours for it to ripen. I guarantee you, we will be voting at 1 a.m. in the morning and 7 a.m. in the morning in order to get something like this through between now and August the 2nd. And we do have to move with haste to get it in writing and to, you know, begin the process. And it is, I don't know if it's Wednesday, but it is very soon. It should have been last week. It should have been a month ago.
A question, if you want to make it specific to one person on the panel, please do.
Sure, I'll address it to Senator Hagan then. How do we parse this debate into a question of growth versus reductions in spending and fiscal responsibility? The premise being that our fundamental problem is jobs and growth. That'll produce tax revenue just in and of itself.
Well, I think you've heard that the issue is so severe where we do need spending cuts and revenue in order to have that job growth. And once again, that's why I like the Gang of Six. It's $3 in spending cuts to $1 in growth. But it also sets the stage for investments. And that's what I think we've got to look at, and that's investments in education, that's investments in infrastructure, and infrastructure would definitely include roads and bridges and broadband and airports. And we've also got to invest in R&D for our country to maintain the global power that we want to be going in as we are in the 21st century. We can't cut back on research and development. That's what's going to make us great. That's what's going to create the jobs of the growth opportunity to hire these unemployed people. So we've got to invest in education, infrastructure, and R&D as we make the other cuts.
Yes.
Historically, it's been the case that we have been on an even keel economically across recessions and booms when the GDP government's share of the GDP has not exceeded 18 to 20%. Right now, we're about 25% or a little north of that. $15 trillion economy, $4 trillion in spending. What is it going to take to increase the GDP and to hold spending down to get back to that traditional 18 to 20%? Many of us in the private sector believe that we can create jobs if we reform taxes, you all have talked about that, and reform regulations. We need major reforms in both. If we get that, you will see the private sector start hiring again, and unemployment going down, and revenues going up.
Anybody want to comment on this, Mark?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge you have is demographics. You know, I tried like heck not to turn 48 this year, and it happened anyway. But that's the biggest problem is he's absolutely right that if we can get the government share of the economy down below 20%, that's great. Because the problem is what's happened in the last year, $1 trillion of private sector debt has been displaced by government sector debt. Government sector debt has a negative multiplier effect. It actually shrinks GDP. In fact, if you go back to the 50s, our GDP has been shrinking every decade by about 0.2%, and it's going to continue to shrink as we age. There's nothing we can do in this country in the next 20 years to avoid being predominantly 65 to 85 years old, just like in Japan. We're 10.5 years behind Japan demographically. What they had in terms of a shrinking GDP, shrinking stock market, rising debt is going to happen to us. The only choice we have is to encourage innovation. Stop taxing income. That is a wealth creation tax, tax consumption. There are things we could do. We could take half the money in Afghanistan and Iraq, bring it back here, that's $60 billion a year, and create a venture fund to explore alternative energy and fuels. That would create 5 million jobs. President Obama actually talked about that on the inauguration day, and everybody's just forgotten about it. But Manhattan Project 2 could be outstanding.
Talk about a State of the Union. John.
There's one thing worth keeping in mind, and that is the enormous deficits we see today, probably $1.5 trillion this year, will diminish as time goes by and the economy recovers. In fact, the CBO acknowledges that, so does just about everybody else who does any projections of the economy. As the economy recovers, the revenues derived from the income tax will recover with it. We'll come from 14.8% of GDP for revenues to about 18% again. We'll quit paying as much for deposit insurance. Food stamps will go down. All of these automatic stabilizers that typically kick in automatically at the outset of a recession will now kick in at the denouement of the recession. And so that's the good news. We can reasonably expect, due to these factors, that by 2014, the deficit of this country will be $500 to $600 billion. That's the bad news. That's a big number.
John Weinberg. Oh, go ahead.
But it's not $1.5 trillion. There will be a decided improvement.
Okay, John Weinberg, and then I'm sorry, they've given me a signal we're a little bit over, so I may not be able to take any more questions unless Senator Hagan overrules me.
I'll overrule it.
Just very quickly, in addition to what everyone just said, it's very important to remember that over time, what drives economic growth in the economy is growth in productivity, growth in our ability to produce goods and services. That's driven by technology, that's driven by investments in human capital. To a large extent, those forces are independent of a lot of what we're talking about today, but they're not entirely independent. And the lack of clarity, the lack of certainty about a long-term plan to fiscal sustainability can, sort of get in the way of some of those long-term investments.
If it was politically feasible, does the U.S. economy need another stimulus, even though it's not politically feasible?
No.
It does not?
No.
Okay. Yes, sir.
It has been suggested that the basic issue is the role and size of government, and the evidence in Republicans not being able to say yes, even though it would, the grand bargain would significantly reduce the deficit.
Your question?
I wonder what the panelists would say with regard to that. Can government do good, or do we have to go with a minimal government with minimal cost?
I think we have to strike a happy medium.
Right.
when you look at the government that we have right now, it has grown in size tremendously over the last decade or so. And that's something that we cannot continue to do. We have to take a good hard look at everything that we're doing and see which ways that we can reduce some of the expenditures that we have. But it's not just government. It's the attitude of the American people. The American people are sitting back letting this happen. We can stop it. If everybody in this room wrote their congressman and their senator before the end of the day, we'd get some movement. If you don't, we won't.
And the message should be?
The message should be, come to a happy medium. The whole U.S. government system is based on compromise. That's the way the Founding Fathers built it. That's the way we've always run it, and that's the way we should run it now.
Yes, sir.
Sure. Senator Hagan, how much would you raise the taxes on the rich? Because under President Clinton said 2000, the top 10% paid 69% of the taxes, the federal income taxes. And under Bush in the year 2008, the top 10% paid 70%. So they're paying more than they did before. Why would you raise taxes on, and how much do you want from the rich?
Well, what I would like to see is what the Gang of Six has done, and that's where you do $3 of spending cuts to $1 of revenue. Most of that is coming from doing away with tax credits and loopholes. Right now, the oil and gas companies are getting about $7 billion, $8 billion a year on an ethanol subsidy. There is no reason with Exxon making $38 billion in the first quarter that they would need that subsidy. So what we need to do is look at the tax code. We need to reform it. We need to make it fairer. We need to make it simpler. In Erskine's Fiscal Commission report, he stated that we collect $1 trillion in tax revenue annually, and yet we have tax expenditures of $1.3 trillion. So if we affect that side of the equation, we can actually bring rates down. We can bring personal income tax rates down as well as corporate income tax rates and still collect more money.
All right, last
so
question.
that would be, to me, the best approach to go forward with.
Last question here, and then we'll close this down. Yes, sir.
I think most people would agree with me that the people who are affected the most by the decisions in Washington are the poor and the unemployed, and they are the ones who are making the biggest shared sacrifice that you mentioned, Senator Hagan. And with all due respect, I would like to ask you, what shared sacrifice do you think the members of Congress should make, along with the rest of us who are...
Part of the Gang of Six report actually shows that federal pay, congressional pay, would be frozen. And, you know, I think we've got to do that. We've frozen it the last 2 years. We need to keep doing that. But we've also got to realize that under the Gang of Six, anybody, social SSI is protected for 5 years. Food stamps are totally protected. There's a lot of protections in that that really do protect the poor. So I can guarantee you, Dick Durbin, who was part of that group, I've been told by Mark Warner that that they really did a lot to protect the bottom margin of our country, and so that they wouldn't be affected. They actually would get more.
Let me just do a final question here. How many people are worried about economic growth, the future of economic growth in America, and believe that, raise your hand. How many people believe that America, this often asked question, compared with Asia and some other parts of the world, is in decline? That we, these are a series of 3 questions. And how many people believe that Washington is dysfunctional and that's part of the decline? My thanks again. I'll go in reverse order to Mark, to John, Amacio, and Greg, and especially for inviting me, Senator Kay Hagan. Thank you.
Thank you.